Everybody who's here. Welcome to this Michigan Jazz Festival virtual presentation. This is a webinar featuring one of my favorite violinists in Detroit. She's played with the Toledo Symphony, the Sphinx Symphony, Michigan Opera Theater, the Flint Symphony, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, River Raisin Ragtime Review, and the Ann Arbor Symphony. On the classical side, on the pop and jazz side, she's played with Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson, Aretha Franklin. Oh my gosh. Roy Hargrove, Xavier Davis, Regina Carter, Diane Shore, Marcus Belgrave. Oh my gosh, what a resume. So she's the absolute perfect person to talk about the influence of classical music on jazz and the influence of jazz music upon classical music. Please give a warm welcome to the great Leslie Deshazor.
Thank you. All right, so I was leaving Cliff Bowles last night pretty late, and I was laughing with Marion saying first thing when
say.
first thing I say this morning is that I get to be in both worlds. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. I was at Cliff Bell's last night, and then this morning I had to get up for CYE and have my rehearsal at 8:30 in the morning. So that's one big difference between the kind of classical and jazz world, just the hours. So I end up being like sometimes doing double duty. But also just to say like these terms that we use, classical, jazz. I mean, obviously we're here agreeing that we're using these terms to describe a really vast art form, but they don't really capture the music in its entirety, but it's just a way to sort of express language, have an agreement. So at any point, if anyone has a question, you could just throw your hand up or like throw it in the chat, and I'll try to pay attention to what's in the chat. So I was thinking a lot about this because I feel like as I get older, I'm finding myself really trying to find balance in navigating these various worlds, and it is not easy. Sometimes it's very difficult to prioritize my practice and be able to, on a moment's notice, pun intended, just joking, on a moment's notice, be able to play, a moment's notice, or like whip out a Telemann unaccompanied viola sonata. So I think some of the things that I've noticed with how we musicians approach each other in terms of like jazz versus classical, there's some misunderstanding, but I think that usually at the higher level, people start to really, really appreciate and respect what's happening on the other side, and then also tend to merge a lot of these ideas. I mean, even composers from early on, like Dvorak, for example, if you listen to his New World Symphony, you'll hear what the American popular and Black American popular art forms were doing in terms of informing his music. So I think that the music itself has always been has had lots of intersections, but the culture around the musicians can vary pretty greatly, right? So I think one thing that I've noticed in the classical world is a lot of frustration with notation and rhythm sometimes when approaching charts that are like more jazz based, right? A lot of it is not written on the page, and you have to actually have some sort of understanding of the music in order to be able to play it. So like when Dennis and Russ and I did his project, I spent a lot of time working out bowings for the string players to make sure that stylistically the bowings could be more within the aesthetic for the music than what we would do, say, if it were like Bach sonata or a Beethoven symphony or something like that. I think there's a misconception a lot of times too that jazz musicians are just jamming, like just having a good time, just making stuff up. And then the other way around, I think sometimes jazz musicians assume that classical music musicians only play what's on the page and don't really expand their mind beyond what's on the page. The study of the score the time spent listening, it's as intense and as thoughtful and dedicated, just a different tradition and passed down differently. So I was thinking about this a lot since Scott asked me about this, because I do a lot of these things without really analyzing the approach from the classical side versus the jazz side. But one of the things that I think we tend to believe is that classical music is better, and that classical musicians are better trained musicians. And what I've found is that is completely not true. We tend to lean towards classical and lean into it as sort of something elite, and for a certain sector of the population. And we view jazz as something, and even historically, that was like for the common people, or even like sinful or dirty, or down in the gutter or whatever. But a lot of that has changed, obviously, because it's been a recognized art form internationally, and now that it's in academia, that makes everything a little bit different, maybe more official, maybe more separatist, maybe heading, unfortunately, more in the direction that classical music is in right now. I think one of the things that I find the most frustrating with the classical world is that we make it inaccessible to everybody. Even the way that people have to behave when they attend classical concerts is really stuffy and uncomfortable, and they can't be, visually or orally like enjoying the music. And I've seen that kind of happening in some concert halls with jazz as well. So the musicians, I think we're responsible for that, right? We need to make it so that all of the listeners can feel like this music is theirs, whether it's classical or jazz. But when I'm approaching my practice time and my music, I really just try to think more broadly about sort of, it's almost like context. Like, we say jazz, but like, what does that really mean? We say classical, but what does that really mean, right? There are a lot of styles within the genre, and each style has its own language, or sort of like, what is the word that I'm looking for? Dialect. So the approach then has to be even more specific, but then more broadly, I think we can all pull from our own cultural experience to help us shape the music, make it more aesthetically within the language that we're trying to approach. So before I go on, I'm just curious, is there any questions about anything I've said so far? No? Okay, cool. I made notes so I wouldn't get off task here. So I thought about rehearsal etiquette, the classical musicians versus jazz musicians. I've observed some differences, and some of the things that I think we tend to do in the classical world is we are extremely rigid about time and punctuality. Rehearsals and things are usually earlier and very sort of like scheduled. I've seen it in the jazz world, but things feel a little looser in the jazz world. Not like, in a negative way, but there's just more openness, more room for a more collective approach to the music, and not so much conductor subjects. Sometimes you see that a lot in the classical world. The conducting thing is really interesting. I had to kind of like get used to that, because in the classical world, you have conductor with a baton, and I've heard a lot of jazz musicians complain about this. So like the whole idea of the ictus, right? So like in the orchestra, conductors actually sometimes place the ictus ahead of the beat on purpose, so that the people in the back of the orchestra will see it hit in the place where they want everyone to actually attack the note. And that can be like really disjointing for like non-classical musicians, because when you see the ictus hit, that's when you wanna play. So that's one thing. And then the count off, like it's very unofficial sometimes in the jazz world, just like 1, 2, 1, 2, right? And so the conductor's kind of walking around, kind of, snapping or clapping. That's very, very different, kind of pointing to this one, pointing to that one, just standing on the side. Very different. Some of the notation things that I think are really interesting, when I first started playing non-classical music, I remember the first time I saw a jazz chart, I was so confused because in classical repertoire, you always write the key signature at the beginning of every single system. And in jazz, it's not the case. So I would be like really second guessing myself, like, wait a minute, what key am I in? Because there was no like thing to my left to remind me of what key it was in. So that's one thing. And then notations, knowing how to swing and the approach to knowing how to swing that frequently always falls flat with classical musicians. I always think too, one thing that's really, 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 really hilarious to me is kind of the different vocalizations we do to sing rhythms, right? So like, I don't know why it tickles me so much, but like in the classical world, if you have a passage, everyone's beat 'em, dot 'em, deed 'em, bottom, like, and it's kind of like this bottom, deed 'em, dot 'em thing. I don't even know why we do that, right? But then in the jazz world, you have like scatting, right? And everyone knows like beat up, bop, sit it, bop, bop, date. Like, and it just, I don't know, like that actually makes me physically out loud laugh sometimes in rehearsal. Um, Movement is kind of funny because like in the classical world, especially like in Detroit Symphony Orchestra, musicians move, but they don't move a lot. It has to be like very controlled movement because you don't want to distract from the performance. You don't see the same thing frequently in the jazz world. But what's very interesting is because of the tradition, I think being a Black American tradition originally, I play in the Sphinx Orchestra and I play in Gateways Orchestra, and I've done this other one called the Color of Music Festival. And these are primarily Black orchestras, very different vibe. A lot more movement, a lot more just looseness. And I think that's just because a lot of our tradition, we kind of come up like in the church and come up in these sort of like communal music situations that make being more visibly pleased with your body acceptable. So that's one big difference. It's just like how we bring in the music, how we absorb it, how we express it. Saying yeah, like after every solo, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like it's definitely a jazz thing. I was like jolted by that at first. Like, why are they talking while someone's soloing? That's so rude. So that's another major cultural, I think, difference in the sort of like rehearsal space, performance space. Um, on the other side, I think that there are orchestras now, though, who are attempting to sort of loosen up the culture a bit, give people a little bit more space. Sometimes their version of that is uh, misguided, but the effort is there, so that's a good thing. So I'm going to pause now and see if there's any questions or comments, anything somebody like to add to what I've said so far. You guys are so quiet. Okay, so I had some interactions on. Oh, Greg.
Sorry, I just jumped in, so I'm not sure what you already covered, but I just wanted to cover my experience. I'm a primarily jazz saxophone player, and obviously I studied classical when I first started in grade school and so on, but pretty much dropped it in high school because I focused solely on jazz. And I can use studying bebop heads or transcriptions or things for technique. But I found later on in life, I had to go back to classical music to really truly develop technique to become a legit bebop player. So, and I learned to enjoy it as well. It first started out kind of as a means to an end, but eventually, it became somewhat of an avocation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I draw from some of the rigor of my classical training. So, like what you were saying with like the bebop heads, like Donna Lee, for example, it's a really technical tune. On string instruments, it's really difficult. So one way that I can marry the two genres with teaching, for example, is I have some students who don't want to play classical music, and I'm totally fine with that. But sometimes I do employ the techniques I've learned in my classical training and basically juxtapose it on whatever non-classical thing that they're learning. So I have a student who wants to always learn video game music, and actually some of that music is very intricate. So I'll just use that as an opportunity to like make him play the entire thing in second or third position, or play it up in a position that he's not learned yet. So just being, getting creative. I think creativity is something that is it's assumed that musicians are creative. That's something that I wanted to talk about too in this talk. Is a lot of people believe that jazz musicians are more creative than classical musicians, but what I found, at least in my experience, is that creativity is something that just sort of like is a personality thing, and it doesn't matter if you play jazz or you play classical. People can play jazz and not be creative, and people can play classical and be creative. So it's all about sort of trying to find your voice within the music, be creative, but also honor the tradition. It's a tricky balance. I think, is it Nedra or Nidra? Nedra?
Hi, I've heard you perform a lot of times. You are absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Sometime in the middle of the talk, hopefully you can, I don't want to do it too soon, you can address sometimes within classical and jazz, that some classical musicians, that the differences in how music is performed and understood. For example, I've heard some and seen online where they think jazz musicians are either don't know proper timing, don't understand, they play flat notes, they're not playing properly notes within the key signature. And so they don't appreciate, I mean, there's even jokes, which it says, oh no, I didn't play a flat note, it's jazz. So they do those young people, I mean, they're young, and they make those kind of jokes. So, oh no, I told my teacher when she said I played the wrong note, I said, no teacher, it's jazz. And it's a ha-ha. So in the fact that it's assumed that there's not some type of system or structure, I may not be using the proper word, even within jazz, within the improv. So those type of nuances that actually are not wrong notes, but being able to understand how to play within a system or time signature or key, or how those things differ, so that when a classical musician hears jazz, they think it's just erroneous, but it's actually not. It's a completely different style. So in some ways later, if you could flush that out, that would be really great.
No, that's a great point. And it's definitely a problem. I think my experience when I first started playing, and actually Vincent was there, he used to help me all the time. But I remember the first time I heard Nina Simone sing, I was in college. I was a freshman, and I remember hearing everyone talk about Nina Simone, Nina Simone, Nina Simone. And my grandfather was like a huge fan of Nina Simone. So I was like, I went to the library at the music school and I got a Nina Simone CD, took it back to my dorm, and I started listening to it, and I was instantly turned off by her voice. Because her voice wasn't pretty, in my opinion. Because at that time, I had this very sterile and stuffy sort of sense of what pretty or beautiful was. I had to reset the way I saw and listened to music when I started diving deeper into other styles of music, not even just jazz, but like I started listening to a lot of traditional Malian music, music from Senegal, West Africa. The aesthetic is so different, the singing style is so different, and it would sound like screaming sometimes to us. But that's because we've been sort of in this world of perfection. That is the downfall, in my opinion, of classical music. And unfortunately, in some ways, jazz is going in that direction too. I think we are taking the human element out of making music and pursuing this perfection. So in classical music, tone has to be perfect and clean. Musicians have to play with perfect intonation. So for me as a violist, my tone and my intonation was everything. So much so that I didn't really work enough on my timing, my stylistic approach. And so when I heard Nina Simone, it took me a minute to like her voice, I have to be honest, because I had that like Western classical, opera trained singer in my head. And so when I heard the roughness and the grit in her voice, it was jolting at first. Um, but then when I listened again later, I loved her voice after some time, immersing myself in understanding her, the music, the history, and then seeing like what kind of musician she was insane. And then I remember listening to Steph Smith. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Steph Smith, but he was our early swing style jazz violinist. Amazing. I mean, nobody really swings harder than Steph Smith. But the first time I heard him, I was like, ooh, his tone is so scratchy. and I, like, it was missed on me at first, because in the classical world, that tone would never fly. Like, you would be banned from your studio if you play with that kind of sound. So I think, to your point, Nadra, there is a lot of like misunderstanding about what the music is asking for. Like, some musicians, I remember Marcus Belgrave would say, like, you've got to have a little bit of grit in your playing. Like, it's okay to have a little grit in your playing. But there's also this misperception that jazz musicians can't play clean, can't play in time, can't play with precision. Not understanding that a lot of people choose to not play that way. They're really trying to like capture the essence of the music, which is in some ways is naturally gritty, depending on what it is. If it's like blues, especially if you're like coming from like Delta, if you're in the gutter blues, that's not supposed to be clean and pretty. But I think the classical world has really failed ourselves in ways with the way that we've pursued perfection, in a sense that has completely robbed the music of its human element. It's something that turns me off about playing classical music. It's something that I try really hard to not perpetuate with students, because it's no fun. It gives you anxiety. It makes you want to quit. It makes you never want to play. You make one mistake on stage and you feel like your life is over. I recently had a professional experience where the music director did not like me because I missed, a couple of notes in the performance, and the anxiety that it gave me made me feel like I was in college again at studio class. So I think that there is a lot of sort of like, snottiness sometimes from the classical world. I remember hearing someone talk about Wayne Shorter and the DSO when he came and did his first piece with the DSO. And I was just blown away, because at that particular time I was at the Grosse Pointe Memorial playing a Bartók quartet. I don't know who in here is familiar with Bartók. Bartók is extremely gritty. It is not pretty. And Bartók all of his music was based on folk melody, and it's very dissonant, right? It's very dissonant. And some of it's pretty, but for the most part, it's very telling of a story. It's hard. It's not soft and beautiful like a Tchaikovsky serenade, But I remember hearing this violist come up to me and go, "Oh my gosh, you were so amazing. I love Bartók." But then in the same sentence, she was talking about how awful it was to play with Wayne Shorter because of all the dissonance. And I was like, I think maybe she just assumed it was awful because it was not classical music, in her opinion. And that's something that I also think is really interesting about the classical world. I always laugh because every year, I don't know how many of you, like Scott's probably been in one of these rehearsals, and I'm sure Vincent has, where there's string players in the rehearsal and you bring your arrangement and there's like an A flat in the violas and like a G in the second violin part, and someone's like, "I have an A flat and they have a G. Is that right?" It's so rubby. It's like, yeah, it's right. It's like dissonance is okay in music. This is 2022. We've been doing dissonance for about 100 years now. So yeah, I totally know where you're coming from, and I think it's sad and it's unfortunate that classical musicians, including myself in the beginning, sometimes miss out on the beauty in other styles of music because we are listening so critically. And that's not really our fault necessarily. It's a training thing. It's how we're taught to listen to music. Very hypercritical, focusing on mistakes, not listening to the overall musicianship of the piece and the performer, not understanding the music as a whole. I think one of the biggest differences between classical and jazz musicians, and I think this is very general and very vague, so I don't want to offend anybody, but The way that we are trained, because we singularly focus on playing a line perfect or a passage perfect or a concerto perfectly, we don't really get the whole immersive experience like we should. So I remember the first time I sat in orchestra after having done a lot more theory study, learned more about sonorities and chords. The first time I sat in orchestra and I listened to Dvorak New World Symphony playing it, I started recognizing, oh, that's augmented, that's diminished, that's this, that's that. And I had heard that symphony probably 50 times before that. But my ears were opened up when I started diving into improvising and playing other styles of music and having to like really dissect the scales versus just playing them up and down for my teacher in tune. So it's really interesting because classical musicians are sort of like credited with having this like sort of like deep in-depth knowledge of music and being like amazing clinicians or like, you know, technicians of the instrument. But honestly, the classical training frequently is very surfacey. Like there really isn't enough emphasis on the functionality of harmony, how the music is moving. And it's probably not as big of a problem with like piano, for example, or harp, where you have to learn chords. But when you look at instruments like violin or viola, or any of the sort of like single line instruments where you don't have to know harmony to play the music, you'll find that a lot of classical musicians are very, I don't want to use the wrong words and offend anybody, but don't really have a good understanding of harmony. Yes, Scott.
Here we go. You mentioned, I mean, you were kind of alluding to education a second ago, and I've been thinking about this all clinic, but it seems like the good spot to ask. But since there is like kind of this big chasm between how classical, especially like in strings, how classical string players are taught and jazz musicians early on, is there anything we can do to teach our educators and maybe being a little more inclusive and getting these young students to embrace this music so it seems more second nature early on?
Yeah, I think definitely this is something that's plagues all educators, right? Because we're limited in time. We have to get students to be proficient at whatever thing they need to do for maybe a concert later, a competition later. And sometimes we don't have enough time to dive as deeply as we'd like. My approach generally is to find a way to incorporate, like immerse the kids in what they're learning. So more singing, more movement, more actual not putting the instrument in your hand stuff. Um, I found that the biggest disconnect or divide right now with students being able to freely express music is that they don't have enough music in their lives when they're not playing their instrument. So when we were younger, we had a lot of things around us. At least me. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but we had things like hand jiving, you know, which I didn't think it was a big deal back then because we did it all the time, you know. Playing these like games with your friends is teaching you amazing rhythmic concepts, but just not thinking about it because you're playing, right? Singing songs in school. Remember when we had to learn how to square dance in school, which is really bizarre. But anyway, it's still something that gave us like culture and movement context for why we play music, right? Because we teach music, but we teach it now like almost as this abstract concept like math, even though it's a lot of these things are highly applicable, we don't make them applicable for students. I think the first step is to expose them to different music. So I always take my speaker in and play music for the students that they probably don't listen to. And then also a lot of singing, a lot of movement. I make them sing, they hate it. But the other thing I think is for teachers to keep learning, because that's a big problem too, is that we don't keep learning and we don't make ourselves uncomfortable learning things that are not within our range or comfort. So we forget what it's like to be on the other side of that learning, you know. Um, I've been having to play a lot of pop music the last couple of years. And before that, I would be like, ugh, pop covers, ugh, so boring. I'll never play pop covers. But then after I started playing it, I was like, this is not as easy as I thought. Like the hardest thing for me is to not overplay a pop tune, right? Because I'm used to like trying to impose this color over this and you know, and then to have to like simplify and just like play melodically and lyrically. That's a skill within itself. So I think like with students, the comfort has to come from having a conversation with them about the music they're playing. Don't be afraid to take some time and discuss the history. Ask them what they think about the music. See if they can relate to it. You know, and then find ways to make the fundamentals more interesting. And maybe you could use something that's not a scale or not a drill to sort of like get them thinking about their technique, but not feeling like it's like a lot of work, because that's nobody likes to do a lot of work. So, does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Anything else? Oh yes, Ben.
You mentioned you kind of see jazz going in the same way as classical, as being like robbed of its human element. How do you see that happening? Like in what ways?
Well, the concert hall is an interesting place, right? Um, these forms of music were not originally intended for a concert hall. They were intended for events, classical as well, right? Um, it's like when we took when Gershwin came along and he took jazz to the concert hall. It gave it a different respect, which is problematic to me, because a lot of what he learned he took from people who were not in the concert hall. He took it to the concert hall and made it famous because of who he was, and we all know why that is. Um, I think, unfortunately, when we start taking these art forms and we move them into these elite spaces, we exclude a lot of people from being able to participate in them. And that's what I mean when I say it's moving in the same direction, because now you got subscribers, people paying a lot of money to hear it. You got to give this perfect show. And that changes the nature of the music, right? I did Hamilton a couple of years ago. I've done Hamilton lots of times now. This is a show that's like majorly popular. Anywhere in the world, it's sold out. They want the same show every single night after night after night, because people are paying big money. It has to be exactly like the recording. So for the musicians, it's like you're kind of becoming a robot, because there's no room for your own expression in there. And I think if you take a look at these art forms that were originally meant to entertain people, like straight up in the town square and the courts or whatever, straight up entertainment in the house. You know, there was a time when people would gather around the piano and sing during family events. We take that, we shift it into these spaces like academia, the concert hall, and suddenly it becomes something that is not accessible for everybody. So that's what I mean by that. Yeah. Any other comments, thoughts, questions? Yes, Greg.
I was wondering if you could comment on the attempts to juxtapose both classical and jazz music. The examples that I know of are things like composed pieces like Claude Bolling and Jean-Pierre Rampal, the Suite for Flute and Jazz Piano, those versions, or things like Stan Getz's Focus, where he totally improvises over a symphony orchestra, or Michael Brecker and Klaus Ogerman, Cityscapes, where Brecker also improvises totally over a composed orchestra. What's your take on that combination? Do you see it as a novelty or a legitimate new form of music, or just in general, what's your opinion on that?
I think it's great. I don't see any problem with it. I think classical musicians might have a harder time accepting some of those things because sometimes you come across more sort of purist. But I've seen my share of purists in the jazz world too. So it's not exclusive to classical musicians. Um, I always encourage the merging of art form because it's natural. And I think it's unnatural for us to try to exist in a bubble and keep a 251 out of the symphony. Like it's just like, the only difference is like you added a 9 or you added a 7, but it's the same system, you know. And a lot, and what I've noticed is, and one of the things I thought about a lot when trying to prepare for this was like, at a certain point, when musicians get to a level where they've done a lot of performing, they start to want to branch out. You know, if you look at like Yo-Yo Ma, for example, who was probably one of the most popular classical performers. Yo-Yo Ma was kind of a household name at some point. He's collaborated with some of everybody. It's like Perlman, same thing, another violinist, famous violinist. Stefan Grappelli would frequently play with other classical violinists. So I think it's actually a natural progression in music to sort of start in one style, and the deeper you dive, the more you start to explore and also see that there's a lot of similarities. I mean, I think the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that classical music originally, if we go back to like Baroque early times, a lot of that music was improvised. And cadenzas were improvised. They were not always all written out. We got away from that, and I think that has a lot to do with the fear of mistakes, the fear of it not being perfect. That's one other thing too, I think, that I thought about this morning when I was doing my rehearsal with my students. The fear of making a mistake is one of the big differences, I think, between classical and jazz. Because in some settings, when you make a mistake, people will say, well, that's where the magic is, you know? Like, you made a mistake, but that sounded really good. Let's keep that. You know? That would never happen in classical music. Like, you wouldn't be, like, encouraged to keep that mistake. But those people who kind of play Baroque music, for example, the ones who work really, like, exclusively in Baroque circles and early music, they actually do quite a bit of improvising and decorations and changes to the music. So to answer your question, Greg, I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it should happen all the time, because I think, unfortunately, we put too many arbitrary dividers up when it comes to art forms, music, visual art, whatever art form that it is. We try to keep it exclusive to a small set of people, which kind of robs us all of an experience, I think. Yeah.
I think Herbie Hancock said, with regards to Miles Davis, a mistake only depends on what the next note or the next chord is that they adapt to.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a mistake in jazz.
No. I think I saw Vincent. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. Eventually, I would love to do something with strings, and as many jazz musicians do, and of course I do have orchestral experience, but I've never written for strings. I've never rehearsed strings, you know. So could you give me some advice, or give the everyone here some advice on maybe some do's and don'ts, pros and cons? Like what could you say to a jazz musician who is interested in involving strings in a project?
Good question. I have some very strong thoughts about that. First of all, don't think because someone's in the DSO that they're the right people to play your music. That's the biggest mistake I see people make. Because I love my DSO counterparts, but a lot of them don't have any experience playing non-classical music. So depending on how you're writing, if you have like swinging lines, or you have lines that are chromatically more like bebop, I would definitely advise you to seek out string players who at least have some experience outside of classical music. That would be the first thing I'd say. Choose people who have relaxed personalities because they'll play more relaxed. Usually when string players go into the studio and play jazz arrangements that are not just pads, Also, don't write pads. That's so boring. But I know you wouldn't do that anyway, Vincent. But when it's not just pads and there's actually like rhythms that are tricky, it gets uptight, it rushes, it's on top of the beat, it doesn't lay back. So I would say find the right musicians. Don't assume that because someone's in the DSO or MOT that they're the right players for your music. Stylistically, find someone who knows how to approach it, like myself. And I usually, like with Dennis, I don't think he's on the call anymore. When we did the session with Dennis and Russ, I did all the bowings ahead of time so that the bowings would be more stylistically in line with the music. That's a huge thing with string players. If you write for string, we are going to spend a ton of time on bowing if you don't have your parts bowed. So that's a major, major thing. And then in terms of writing, there's some things that as a violist, I'm not super in love with, that people always write the best stuff in the violin part. The viola parts are usually an afterthought because frequently nobody knows what the viola does. It's like this big violin sitting in the middle of the section. What are you doing there? They don't understand alto clef, so they just shy away from it and write a bunch of whole notes in the viola part. So what I think the first thing is finding the right players. And then the bowings. Bowings are everything, everything, everything. For string players, you can streamline your process and get through your work a lot faster if you have solid bowings in the part already. Other than that, I mean, obviously you got to get good musicians. I'm not saying forego the competent musicians, but I see a lot of this whole, like, I got to get DSO players to play my music. There's a lot of people out here who are not DSO players who can do more justice to your music. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh.
Oh,
Craig? Oh, you're muted.
How about this? Can you hear me? I led the Brookside Jazz Ensemble back in the 70s and 80s, which was some of the best jazz musicians in the Detroit area. And we started to incorporate, like other big bands, some of the rock type pieces, fantasy, rocky, Maynard was doing it. I was surprised that the jazz musicians had a very difficult time playing the rock phrasing and the rock styles, very similar to what we're talking about between the classical and the jazz. It was the same kind of thing between the jazz and the rock. It was just, first of all, they were like, ooh, rock, why are we playing this? And then the fact that they could not grasp the phrasing, it took a lot of rehearsing and a lot of explaining and convincing. And then, of course, we'd play a show and the people would go nuts. We'd play 80%, 90% jazz, straight ahead jazz and big band charts. And then we'd play Rocky or something and the people went nuts, because the audience is diversified and less sophisticated than most of the musicians most of the time. But I was very surprised by that, by the fact that the jazz musicians weren't able at first to interpret the rock stuff accurately.
Yeah, I think that goes to kind of like what I was thinking about, like with Vincent's question. Aesthetically, how we align with music has a lot to do with understanding the history of it and really like listening hard, right? So like, because I play so many different styles of music, I kind of can get a little bit of a chameleon, but I also can get like really confused sometimes. I'm like, wait a minute, what am I playing right now? But like, for example, one of the things that string players do a lot that kind of kills the vibe when they're playing non-classical is using too much vibrato. So like when you're writing, Vincent, for strings, that's something you want to think about. You want to think about how much vibrato you want in your music, because classical string players tend to just default to using a lot of vibrato. And vibrato doesn't necessarily like work very well in like rock music unless you're using it as an effect. It doesn't work very well in pop music. It's too heavy. It works beautifully in Tchaikovsky. It works beautifully with Dvorak, but it actually doesn't work as well with Bach. Like early classical, early Baroque music doesn't call for as much vibrato. So that's one of those stylistic things, like what Craig's talking about, is understanding phrasing. Is different. Just because you can read music doesn't mean that you're going to execute it. And that's something too, I think classical musicians we kind of mess up with, is we trust our eyes more than we trust our ears. And that happened to me last night. I was playing with Straight Ahead at Cliff Bells, and they threw a tune at me I hadn't played, and she's like, "Oh, it's just A minor." So they started playing, and I'm like, it doesn't feel like A minor, but it's loud on stage, so you can't really check to see where it is. And so I'm looking at the page and it's saying A minor. I start to play. I play an A. I play a C, and instantly it doesn't fit. And I realized that the chart is a alto saxophone chart. So now I have to use my ears, right? But my ears were telling me before I even started to play that was not A minor. But I was trusting my eyes over my ears, and that's my classical training. And I've seen that happen a lot in the classical world. It's like they play a chart, and the note is clearly not the right note, but that's what's written. That's what's written. But it doesn't sound right. So stop playing that. You know? But that's the thing. It's like we don't rely on our intuition at all because we're discouraged from doing so. But then when you are thrown into other genres like rock or something else, like you kind of got to use more intuition. You got to think more about imitating a language. It's not gonna be on the page. You know, I've sight read at gigs, and it's been like, I remember one time I was sight reading Halo by Beyonce. Have you guys ever heard that song?
Mm-hmm.
And if you know how Beyonce sings, imagine notating her singing her riffs. It looks like Chinese that I had never seen on the paper, and I was just like, trying to play it, it sounded crazy. And then when I got to the chorus, I was like, oh, I know this song. It was like at a wedding. It's like, I had to stop looking at the page because looking at the notes were confusing me because the notation, you can't capture some of these more like, the people kind of music. You can't capture how that's supposed to sound on a piece of paper. There has to be understanding of the way the music actually, flows stylistically. If you're trying to emulate like Earth, Wind, and Fire, singing a song, like you don't really want to read that off of paper. It's gonna sound silly. You want to transcribe it. You want to actually play with the singer and see if you can match what the singer's doing to get close. So yeah, there's a lot of assumptions that because you can read music, you can play any music, but that's definitely not true. Naja.
Piggybacking on what you just said regarding playing and hearing the piece, a lot of times I've seen written music and it's on a song that had vocals. And clearly when I'm trying to play it, I hear it in my head and I'm thinking, this doesn't sound anything like it because like you said, they can't always properly translate it. For just a layperson, outside of the more deeper theory and understanding of jazz, what would you recommend in those cases? Because you have an ear and you're diversified. Again, I've heard you perform many times in different ways. You are absolutely fabulous. I just really wanted to say that. But for others who are layperson like myself with nowhere near those skills, but want to develop more, what would you recommend? Because I find that some of the most amazing classical performers, and I love classical music as well, I'm diversified in music, they can't improv. Even the top ones traveling, they admit they can't improv. Yeah. What can you tell us as far as a layperson or either someone who's a student, which is me still, what we can do in addition to listening to help us be able to do that so that if we go to a gathering with friends, we can begin to hear and begin to try to play along. I'm sorry if that's just a basic layperson's question for everyone else, but just a way to develop that as someone who studies the violin.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I've been in settings where some string player was told to improvise and they almost pooped their pants. So scared. Like, so scared. And I know that feeling. Like, I'm kind of bold. So even though my heart's like on the floor, boop, 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 like I go. Vincent used to be with the Bird of Paradise with me, like whispering chord changes in my ear, like at sessions. But I think a good place to start is to start where you actually are. I think that's the mistake most people make, and I do that too. It's to not start where you are. Like you try to start somewhere else, especially if you're already a musician. Like, oh, I already know how to play, so I'm gonna start learning all these like hard bebop lines, and you didn't even like bother to learn anything about the blues, So I think starting where you are means, okay, so if you're working on, say you're working on a scale like harmonic minor, find ways to improvise on the harmonic minor sounds without like a genre attached to it, right? Like start with that. Or if you're learning a piece of music that's simple, take a hymn, take a simple melody and work on embellishing it, do something else with it, just any other thing with it than what is on the paper or what you've, heard done before. And then you can take melodies, like the other day I was listening to Skylark, listening to different versions of Skylark, which is such a beautiful tune, and try to play Skylark like 3 or 4 different vocalists. Just hear what they've done with it. I think most people just start to complicate it, start trying to do a lot of things that just they can't hear. So it doesn't really make sense to do that. It's like, what can you hear? You can definitely hear a major sound. You can hear a minor sound. You can probably hear some basic progressions like 1-4-5-1 or 2-5-1. And just thinking outside of genre, how can you be creative with what you already know? So with some of my students, I don't like to even associate jazz and improvisation, because the moment you say improvise, they start thinking jazz. They start thinking Coltrane. They start thinking Charlie Parker, which is going to make anybody hide under a rock if you've never even approached it, because you're talking like masters who still nobody can play like. So I would say, like, if you're working out scales, you can use something simple like backing tracks to work on your scales. I do that with students. If we're working in the key of A minor, I'll bring in either my loop pedal or do a backing track in A minor. We play through the scale, and I just say rearrange it, do it in a different order. Don't start on one, start on a different note. And usually what was interesting to me is when they can let go and not be so scared, they come up with really interesting ideas, and they're natural phrasers, actually, for the most part. Most of it is just the fear, getting over the fear of messing up or looking bad. I've realized, like, a lot of things have changed for me education-wise, especially with this pandemic. It occurred to me, like, when we educate, kids don't really get a chance to be creative. We tell them how to do everything. They don't know how to brush their teeth, how to pull up their pants, how to put on their socks, how to blink their eyes, how to look to the right. Don't do that. Don't say that. And then we throw them into a setting and go, okay, now be creative. Like, but you've been telling me not to be for 10 years. So now what do I do? And so then you look at adults, now you're looking at 30 years of that or 40 years of that, of always being dictated, how you do something. We live in a very dictatorial society, even though we don't live under a dictator. We follow rules all the time. And there's rules within music, but sometimes the rules can really bog you down and make you not want to play. So I think a good place to start is to do something where you don't really have rules, and just be creative and see where it takes you. Because a lot of it is just getting over that fear of doing it. And once you can get past that, then you can start to be more analytical, work harder on specific things. And then within, jazz, that's such a vague term, like maybe focus on a single style within it. Maybe you want to focus on swing. Maybe you want to focus on the blues. I wouldn't just be trying to focus on all of jazz, like from the jump. Like, that's just going to kill your brain. So that's what I say. Just start where you are and build from there.
Thank you. Yes,
I can ramble on. Yeah. Scott, you had your hand up at one point.
This was actually a while ago when Vince was talking about string writing, and I just a couple things occurred to me that I wanted to bounce off you, Leslie. One of them was when I started writing, I immediately applied it kind of like keyboard writing, and saw how bored the string players got pretty quickly. And you were kind of alluding to, well, not alluding to, you were directly talking about writing pads, which for all those of you who don't in the room don't know about pads, it's just writing, whole notes, half notes, and pretty much like the most boring thing, just color while everyone else gets the interesting parts, but I remember a string player pulled me aside and said, write for each of the string instruments with interesting lines in a more linear style. And it was like everything just kind of blew up, and I noticed everything I wrote was a little more interesting. And the string players were all much happier with what I gave them. But it's hard come from a pianist who's used to thinking vertically and just thinking from a chord standpoint rather than per instrument. But just the feeling of working with string players who were happy instead of like, yawning
Yep.
was really awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what we're used to hearing. Strings as a sort of like blanket of sound, right?
Well,
But
it's so incredible because you guys blend so easily. That's woodwinds are so hard to write for because there's just so much different personality, but you guys have you guys all play the same instrument, so you can take so many liberties in writing all these intricate lines and things come together so much better. And
yeah, I think the writing for strings in the jazz world is interesting because I had a funny thought a couple weeks ago because I just did a record and I was like, my next record's going to be Leslie with horns, right? Because in the jazz world, for some reason, when people arrive, they're like with strings. It's a thing, like Charlie Parker with strings. Roy had his record with strings. Like that's like a big deal, right? So I thought it was funny to reverse that and be like with horns. But I agree, and especially for the violas, I have to advocate for the violas because people write terribly for viola, and I do mean terribly. Always out of range, always boring, always the last thought. Oh, the violas. Let me throw something together really quick. So, and also too, don't be afraid to write in treble clef for viola sometimes, because I know like the clef thing is a problem for a lot of people with viola. It's alto clef is like on an island all by itself. And we read in treble, so much so that when I do jazz gigs and people give me a part in alto clef, my whole world is thrown off. I don't know what to do with that because I'm so used to reading in treble clef. It totally like confuses me when people write in alto clef for like, parts that are more intricate. In a studio setting, that's different. But on stage, like when I played with Vincent, I think your parts were in treble clef, which is good. Alto would have messed me up.
I hope so.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, these are really interesting things. I think the only other thing that I saw like in the chat was somebody mentioned something about, in the Facebook group was something about sight reading. I know that was something that Brendan Davis had mentioned. And I thought about this, but I know a lot of jazz musicians who have great eyes, I know one thing I would love to kill. I would love to kill the term legit player. Like, I can't believe people still say that. Like, what is that? Are you legit? I guess that means, do you read? Is that what that's supposed to mean? But the opposite would mean that like someone like Perry Hughes, who's an amazing guitarist, is not legit. So
it also refers to nuances in our articulations. Because I just had a student who auditioned for college, and when he came back to me, he said he was accepted and everything, but when he played a classical piece, the teacher said, "Oh, I could tell you study jazz because, a certain way he did or didn't use his tongue to articulate the notes." She said she could tell that he played jazz, and so I think it, and I also had a teacher who would always say, when you're playing legit, you should do this, you should do that,
okay.
because as legit players, you should play this way, and so it's more of certain nuances and articulations, even a certain tone quality they're referring to when they say the word legit.
Legit. Yeah, that word needs to die when it comes to describing musicians. Because what's the opposite? Illegitimate? Like, so I can play all this wonderful stuff, but because my tone isn't as super clear as the French horn is, at the Met, then I'm not as legit. That's a really interesting thing that I've heard it said, and it's really it blows my mind that we still use terms like that. I think they're racist and elitist and need to die because it makes no sense. It's like some of the phrasing things that people come to classical music with actually might bring some life to some of that music, and I think any composer, like any of us in the room who write, we're open, like we are okay with changes to our music sometimes. Somebody might do something, you're like, oh, that actually was better than what I wrote, you know? Or I like that. Let's put that, let's keep that. So I think when you look at like these composers like Beethoven, he'd probably be shocked if he came back and found out that his symphonies were being played the exact same way 100 years later or 200 years later. You know what I mean? Like, why have you people not done something else with my music? Why are you doing exactly the same? Or maybe he'd be wanting it to be the same, but I just kind of think anyone who composes at that level is evolving. They're not going to want to hear something be the same all the time. You know, you look at like the life of Wayne Shorter, for example, his music from start to now has evolved into something totally different than what he started with. So yeah, anyway, I think that's mostly our time, right? Is that?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. You know, we traditionally like to open this time up for questions. We've had so many questions already. It seems like people are kind of getting their questions answered. But is there anybody who has either anything you'd like to say or a specific question? It can be about this webinar or something about Leslie and her career or anything. Anyone who'd like to speak up? Such a polite group of people.
I like, oh, Dennis.
Yeah, I'm just knocked out by your brilliant, informative session. I mean, you hit so many wonderful points, Leslie, and you did it in such a communicative way so everybody could have an understanding and participate. And that's really a brilliant way to present such an informative topic. On an earlier note, when you were talking about the album you did with Russ Miller and myself, I will tell you that our first thought when Russ and I were doing the music together, and he arranged it beautifully, I wrote a lot of the tunes, he arranged them. Our first thought was to get you and to have you be the stimulus for all of the string players that we brought in. And we had about 16 string players, and you found each one, because we had a lot of experience with different players in the area and beyond, including the DSO and orchestras other places. And we wanted you to be the middle of that. And I know that Russ met with you individually just to go through, the two of you, just to go through the thoughts and the phrases. And we were trying to incorporate interesting lines for all the string players and not, like you were saying, leaving the violas behind. And Mozart's favorite was the viola, as you know, so he always wrote good parts. But the things that you've talked about in Vincent's questions and thoughts and Scott's and everybody else's there about combining different styles of music are really right on the button. And I think I mentioned to you, I took my family to see Hadestown that you played in, the musical downtown. I think it was the Fisher. And you were improvising, and I just told my wife and daughter, I said, now listen to what Leslie's doing, because you took it to a whole nother place, and that was very eclectic music. So I congratulate you on your career and your family and everything that you're doing in your teaching. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. And I want to say too to Ramsey, you're right. We don't have to separate the music. Humans, we like to separate ourselves.
I just want to say it was great to meet you and to learn about you and your career. And this presentation was wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. You all had great comments and questions that made it easier for me. If you'd all been super quiet, I'd been like, oh boy. Oh, Vincent, your hand's up.
Yeah, I don't know how many string players we have in the room, but when it comes to playing viola, violin in the jazz world, then there's the issue of equipment, amplification, and I'm sure that's something that you've had trials and tribulations with that. Could you talk a little bit about the conclusions you've come to when it comes to amplifying yourself, balancing with horn players and the typical jazz instrumentation?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I got advice from Christian House, who's an amazing violinist. Bring your own sound So what that would mean, like for me, I always bring my own DI that also has a EQ on it and volume. I bring my own amp. I bring my own everything except my own chords, except for, whatever's going through the house. So that's the first thing, have your own setup. Don't rely on the venue because they're probably not going to have anything that's going to be justified. It's going to be good enough for a string player to be heard. The viola is even trickier, and cello's pretty tricky too because of the range. They get lost in the texture really easily. So like with my viola, I play my non-classical gigs, I use my carbon fiber instrument amplified. What I found with the carbon fiber is because it's not wood, the threshold is greater before it starts to distort or to get distorted. Also with the wood, sometimes when you're using a pickup, you get a lot of like in the sound because of the vibrating of the wood. So that's the main thing. The other thing too is not to be afraid to ask people around you to play softer, because I was really afraid about that. At first, I would just, not say anything. But now I'm like, hey, I need to preserve my arms. So I don't need to be like pushing. Plus it messes up my sound. And I sound bad because I'm trying to play louder than everybody in the space. Horn players, you guys have an advantage because you can play very loud. And so sometimes that lends itself to too loud. So I now do ask people to bring down the overall stage volume so I can not have to play too hard. The other thing too is making sure that your monitor on stage is loud enough, because usually whatever it is in sound check, it has to be louder once everyone starts to play. And now I use an electric also, which I never thought I would do. I never thought I'd use an electric instrument, but I use the electric instrument and I use pedals, and that also gives me some control of my sound. So that's another thing. But having some of your own equipment is the best way to deal with it. Yeah. Don't play into a mic at a session. Like, it's not gonna work. It never works. So unless the players are unless it's like a DSO, those sound guys will be paying attention and adjust your mic. But if you're like Burt's, forget about it. You might as well be up there screaming with no sound. Nobody's gonna hear you. So, yeah, good question. Anything else?
Any other questions? Well, on behalf of the Michigan Jazz Festival, Leslie, we really do appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you so much for spending the morning with us. How about a round of applause?
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Before we go, can you tell us anywhere that we might be able to see you?
Like it's hotels tonight. What else do I have coming up? I'm actually going to be going out of town a whole bunch between now and May, but I'll be back, and I'm doing Dirty Dog in June on the 1st and 2nd. I'll be there. And then other than that, it's just a bunch of private stuff. So, but yeah, and I also just released a record. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, it's streaming on all the platforms. So I'd love feedback for those people who do have a chance to listen to it. Yes, thanks.
I wanted to mention too that Leslie had a wonderful article in the International Musician, which is the American Federation of Musicians of this country and Canada, and it featured you and all of the stylistic background to your playing and all the things you do to make a living as a musician and a teacher and performer, and I thought it was just great that you were highlighted in that issue.
Yeah, that was a nice surprise. It was originally supposed to just be a feature. It wasn't supposed to be a cover.
Oh, it's great. It was fantastic. Yeah. I saved it for you in case you want it. I have it.
They sent me 8 copies.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thank you for coming out. And our next one of these will be in May with the great Andrew Bishop. So we hope to see you back then. Well, we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Leslie.
You're welcome.